Welcome to the APH Access Academy, celebrating Women's History Month. We are glad you are joining us today. We have our very own Mike Hudson, our museum director at the American Printing House for the Blind, and we are going to cover these objectives: study the history of personal achievements by women in the blindness field over time, examine individual and groups of women of historical significance to the blindness field and the effect that historical events have had on women, and challenge or expand the traditional historical understanding of the role of women in the blindness field. And without further ado, Mike, I am going to turn this crowd over to you.
Outstanding. Well, I'm coming to you from my office here at the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind, and I want to thank you all for coming aboard as we walk a little bit through some of the contributions of significant women to the blindness field. First off, I want to start out by borrowing a quote from the historian Joni Johnson Lewis from 2019, and she was answering the question, what is women's history? So, quote, "What we call women's history is an approach to the study of history. It is based on the idea that history, as it is usually studied and written, largely ignores women and women's contributions. Women's history assumes that ignoring women and women's contributions leaves out important parts of the full story. Without looking at the women and their contributions, history is not complete. Writing women back into history means gaining a fuller understanding," unquote. And then some quotes from some of the first women's historians, some of the founders of women's history, at least here in the United States. This is from Gerda Lerner. Quote, "Women have always made history as much as men have, not contributed to it. Not only did they not know what they had made and had no tools to interpret their own experience. What's new at this time is that women are fully claiming their past and shaping the tools by means of which they can interpret it," unquote. And then Mary Ritter Beard, who was wrote about women's history early in the 20th century, really before women's history as a field had been created. Quote, "The dogma of women's complete historical subjugation to men must be rated as one of the most fantastic myths ever created by the human mind," unquote. My mom would have loved that one. And then finally, a quote, just really mentioning Elisabeth Fox Genovese, who in the 1980s is credited with creating the first graduate program in women's studies. Now, when we turn to our own field, the history of the blindness, the history of education and rehabilitation for people that are blind and visually impaired, indeed, the early histories are flush with tales of Valentine Aureus and Francois Lesueur and Louis Braille and John Alston, and Johann William Klein and Samuel Gridley Howe and Julius Friedlander and William Waite and Joel Scott and Oscar Pick and Frank Hall, and even woke as I aspire to be. I have probably given 1 million tours here at APH where I didn't mention the contributions of a single woman character. But unlike military histories or histories of the American West or the American Revolution or almost any other branch of historical inquiry where women's contributions to history have been, purposefully or not, fairly obscure, women have from the first played an integral role in the education and rehabilitation of people who are visually impaired. Unlike the military or industry or, hiking with Daniel Boone through the Cumberland Gap, two vocations that have almost always been seen as appropriate and natural for even the most oppressed female population were those of teaching and nursing. And with their association with child rearing, it was almost always okay with society for a woman to pursue a career in teaching or nursing. So for most of the last 250 years, over which the blindness field has emerged as a thing, the majority of people working in our field have been women. They maybe didn't always get the credit they deserved or the promotions, but unlike fields like law, medicine, business, or the military, they never had to justify their aspirations in those fields. But folks, before you pat yourselves on the back and thank the stars that you live in a more enlightened age, when our daughters can aspire to any vocation, pursue any dream, even the presidency. Thank you, Kamala. There are some interesting statistics about where women, modern women, choose to work today in 2021. Pre-K and elementary school teachers, 97% are women. Dental hygienists and assistants, 97% are women. Speech language pathologists, 96% are women. Child care workers, 94% are women. Medical assistants, 90% are women. So these forces in our culture that determine where it is appropriate, acceptable, and desirable for women to make their mark continue to be strong. And the boundaries they create, if invisible, are nonetheless binding for it. But my point really is that women have been in our field from the beginning and have been recognized for it. A perfect illustration of this is the Hall of Fame for Leaders and Legends of the Blindness field, housed here at the American Printing House for the Blind. And by the way, nominations for the Hall of Fame are now open, and you can find the nomination process on our APH website. And I encourage all of you to nominate the leaders and legends from your own career. So there have been 66 people inducted into the Hall of Fame since its charter class was added in 2002. 18 have been women. That's 27%. So let's take a walk through the lives of these amazing 18 women. We're going to do it alphabetically. So that's just the way we're going to do it. So Georgie Lee Abel. Georgie Lee attended the Tennessee School for the Blind and then graduated from the Peabody College for Teachers with a master's degree in English. She taught at the Idaho School for the Blind, the Iowa School for the Blind, and finally at Overbrook School for the Blind. And at the end of World War II, Georgie Lee joined the American Foundation for the Blind just as the retrolental fibroplasia bubble of kids hit the system. And Georgie led their efforts at AFB to prepare public schools to accommodate them. In 1960, Georgie Lee Abel joined the faculty at San Francisco State University, and it was Georgie that hired future Hall of Famers Stan Suterko and Pete Wurzburger and built the vision program there at San Francisco State into the powerhouse it became. Lou Johnson Alonzo. Lou Alonzo majored in audiology and also as a TBI. She taught in public school and later at the Michigan School for the Blind. And in 1948, Lou began a remarkable 50-year career at Michigan State University, beginning as an assistant professor and then, beginning as just a graduate assistant and then working her ways through assistant professor, associate professor, professor, and professor emeritus. And she coordinated the teacher prep program in visual impairment there for 39 years. And later she initiated and coordinated the programs in deaf blindness and in orientation and mobility. And she was a major player in the creation of other vision programs around the country and co-founder of the journal Teaching Exceptional Children. Natalie Barbosa was a Texan with a doctorate from the University of North Texas. And she started out teaching home ec in the public school. But her daughter, Karen, needed some orthopedic work, which led their family to New York, and there a job for Natalie at teaching kindergarten at the New York Institute for the Blind, which led to a job teaching home ec at the Texas School for the Blind. In 1963, she joined the faculty at UT Austin, where she taught for 20 years. And she's best remembered for her scholarship on low vision and visual efficiency, her book, Visual Handicaps and Learning, that she wrote with Jane Aaron, and numerous book chapters and articles. Mary Kay Bauman received her master's in psychology from Penn, and during World War II developed a set of manual dexterity tests for people that were blind, leading to the creation of a totally original testing and vocational guidance service for people that were blind in Philadelphia. She would go on to become the president of the American Association of Workers for the Blind, the executive secretary of the Association for Education of Visually Handicapped, and was a promoter of the move to merge those two into the professional group that governs our field today, the AER. Her work and her scholarship on vocational evaluation and the psychology of blindness was pathbreaking. Eleanor Fay, born in Hawaii, received her MD in 1950 from Stanford, became the director of the Lighthouse Low Vision Services, and Eleanor Fay became the medical expert on low vision. And her classical work, Clinical Low Vision, is still widely used. Martha Louise Morrow Fox. She graduated from the Overbrook School for the Blind in Philadelphia and left Temple University in the 1920s to accept a position out in the middle of nowhere at the Piney Woods Country Life School in Rankin County, Mississippi. She would finish her education in summer school from the Hampton Institute. And when the Piney Woods School added a department for African American students who were blind or visually impaired, Martha Fox became the first teacher with 10 students. She taught grades 1 through 8. In addition to providing the students education, she was also responsible for their personal care, their health care, and their moral and spiritual needs. Everything. One-stop shop. Her music groups toured to raise funds for the school, and some of her students gained fame as the Five Blind Boys of Mississippi. She was a great proponent of Braille, and she became the first principal of the Black Division of the Mississippi School for the Blind in 1950. And in 2013, Martha Fox became the first woman of color inducted into the Hall of Fame. Catherine Frances Gruber. Kay Gruber graduated from Minnesota and taught children with visual impairments, first in Minneapolis and then later in New York. And in the 1940s, Kay became the director of both War Blind Veteran Services and Professional Services at AFB, positions she held simultaneously until her retirement in 1963. Kay Gruber was instrumental in working with Warren Bledsoe and Russ Williams to launch the Hines Blind Rehabilitation Center in the 1950s, personally securing the necessary materials and equipment to get the program going. And she stayed at Hines for 6 weeks, right at the beginning, and helped choose many of the pioneering staff members at the Hines VA Center. She personally trained many of those early trainers. She arranged and conducted countless summer school courses and workshops for teachers of blind children. And together with Pauline Moore, she edited AFB's publication, No Place to Go, a significant publication on the education of severely disturbed blind children, which in 1963 was ahead of its time. Kathleen M. Hubner began her career as an O&M specialist and itinerant TBI. After receiving her PhD from Pittsburgh, she accepted a position as a national consultant in education for AFB, where she worked from 1983 to 1993, initiating many national initiatives there at AFB. And from 93 to 2012, Kathy prepared TBIs and O&M specialists at Salish University. Her career culminated in 2 groundbreaking collaborative national consortia of universities to increase leadership through preparation of doctoral students in visual impairment, deaf blindness, and deaf and hard of hearing. These were the National Center for Leadership in Visual Impairment and the National Leadership Center for Sensory Disabilities. Ruth Carlisle. Ruth received her PhD from the University of Michigan, and her early work was in social work in Lansing. And while working at the Industrial Home for the Blind in Mineola, she developed plans for integration of blind children into the public schools. She worked as an itinerant TBI for a while on Long Island. She supervised a day school for emotionally challenged children. And in 1963, all that prepared Ruth to join the faculty at Western Michigan University to begin their rehabilitation teaching program. And that involved developing the curriculum, acquiring the equipment, selecting the students, locating the internship settings, and building their library. And for the next 23 years, Ruth was involved in offering graduate courses, refining program content to include low vision, multi-handicaps, gerontology, technology, and in the latter years, she served as chairperson of the Department of Blind Rehabilitation. Because of Ruth's pioneering work in the profession of rehabilitation teaching and her development of university curriculum, she's often referred to as the founder of rehabilitation teaching. Now, Helen Keller's story is a familiar one, right? She lost her vision and hearing as a young child and became the most famous person with a disability in the world when the work of her teacher, Anne Sullivan, was published. She became the first American with deaf blindness to earn a college degree and grew up to become a prolific writer, social activist, fundraiser, and champion for women's rights, civil rights, disability rights, and labor. And I will note here that all her life, Helen had to struggle against a society that wanted to lock her in to a public persona as a virginal young girl or a curiosity or a sideshow feature. Even into her 50s, newspaper accounts would describe her appearances as by the famous blind girl. One of the most dangerous things about little girls is that they grow up. Anne McCuskey began her career as a teacher at the Halifax School for the Blind, where she eventually became the director of programs and services for students who are blind or visually impaired at the Atlantic Province's Special Education Authority, which is what Halifax evolved into. And Anne's research focused on the social interaction of children with visual impairments and their need for and success in establishing friendships. Her groundbreaking book was promoting acceptance of children with disabilities from tolerance to inclusion. And that book has been used as a text in many university classes preparing TBIs. Recognizing the importance of professional qualifications and standards, Anne also organized and directed the TBI preparation program at Mount St. Vincent University and also taught courses at the University of British Columbia. Sally Mangle. Sally attended the California School for the Blind for a time, but like many of her generation, graduated from public high school. Her MA came from Georgie Lee Abel's program at San Francisco State College, and her PhD was joint between SFSU and UCal Berkeley. Initially, she taught for 18 years as a TBI in the Castro Valley Public Schools, and then joined the faculty at San Francisco State University, where she was a pioneer in the distance education program, which was an innovative model for preparation of teachers of the visually impaired. Throughout her life, Sally had a passion for Braille literacy. And in 1973, she developed the Mangle Developmental Program of Tactile Perception and Braille Letter Recognition, a tool which was widely used to teach beginning Braille and which has been translated into 7 languages. In 1997, Sally got a National Science Foundation grant that enabled her to develop the Speech-Assisted Learning System, the SAL, a portable, interactive, computer-based Braille tutor, which enabled many blind teens and adults to teach themselves Braille. Her dream of opening doors for Braille learners who wanted to explore the fields of science, math, and engineering motivated the emergence of a more modern version, the SAL 2. And her 45 books, articles, videos, and technological innovations raised national and international awareness of the importance of Braille literacy. Alice Raftery, Miss Alice. Among the many giants mentioned here is one of my favorites. As a newbie staff member at APH in the mid-2000s, I was routinely placed next to Miss Alice at Hall of Fame induction ceremonies, and it's hard to express how precious those memories are and how badly Miss Alice is missed. Alice was born in Detroit and earned a BS in nutrition and institutional management from Marygrove College in 1949, got married, started raising a large family, and for most other people of her generation would never have been heard of again. But in the early 1960s, Alice's lifelong struggle with macular degeneration left her legally blind. She returned to school, received her master's degree in blindness and rehabilitation in 1967, and began a career as a rehabilitation center at the Greater Detroit Agency for the Blind and Visually Impaired in 1968. And that was followed by positions at St. Joseph Mercy Hospital, the Mount Carmel School of Nursing, and the Rehabilitation Institute. Throughout her career, Alice Raftery was in high demand as a conference and workshop presenter on the topics of working with the deafblind population, insulin management, the psychosocial aspects of blindness, initial client assessment, aging, and blindness, to name a few. And her outlook, Alice's outlook on her career in the blindness field was best summed up in her own words, quote, "It's exciting to participate in the restoration of lifestyles," said Alice. "Helping people to progress from hopelessness to confidence and competence is a thrill and a joy," unquote. You never saw Alice without a smile on her face. She was the best. Sally Roeg was born in Brooklyn, but graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1951. Her first master's degree was in anthropology at Columbia, but when that didn't stick, she got a second one in education from the University of Michigan. And she taught early childhood education at the Michigan School for the Blind in the 1960s and at Simon Fraser University later. In the 1970s, she created the teacher training program for the visually impaired and multi-handicapped at the University of British Columbia, where she taught until her retirement in 1955. And Sally's pioneer studies significantly expanded our understanding of language development and literacy in children with disabilities. In her research, Sally explored the historical abuse and neglect of children with disabilities throughout the world, and especially in Hitler's Germany, which propelled her into the forefront of the disability rights movement. Susan Spungen was, by her own definition, a New Yorker. She majored in music at Skidmore College and then attended San Francisco State University, where she came under the influence of George Lee Abel and discovered a dear love for Braille. She began her career as a TVI in San Francisco before returning to New York. And after a few years working for the New Jersey Commission for the Blind, she was hired by AFB as their national specialist in education. And she would remain with AFB until her retirement in 2008 as the vice president for international programs and special projects. She got her doctorate of education from Columbia in '75, and her dissertation was, in effect, the start of professionalizing the teaching of students who are visually impaired. She laid out in meticulous fashion the competencies that teachers needed in order to educate children with visual impairments. The first effort to do so in a movement that has led to specific teacher licensing standards in many states. And that dissertation became a book, Competency-Based Curriculum for Teachers of the Visually Handicapped, 1975, the first of many publications offered by Susan for AFB. She was one of the first to notice that the visual efficiency pendulum had swung too far away from Braille and into almost a print at all costs mentality. Her 1990 pamphlet, Braille Literacy, Issues for Blind Persons, Families, Professionals, and Producers of Braille, was the first to document the crisis that would come to dominate most of the 1990s. Anne Sullivan Mason is also a woman whose story is widely known. Abandoned by her father in an almshouse, Annie showed up at the Perkins School for the Blind in 1880, unable to read and wearing borrowed clothes. 6 years later, that girl was the class valedictorian. You go, girl. Offered by her mentor, Dr. Anagnos, to help an Alabama family with their deafblind daughter, she boarded a train only days after yet another surgery to help correct her failing vision. Only a few months later, at the age of 20, Using the most advanced special education techniques of her day and a boundless passion, Annie helped young Helen Keller break through the language barrier and became, in fact and deed, the miracle worker. Every TVI since, male or female, has been riding in Annie Sullivan's wake. Mary Switzer, like Annie Sullivan, was of Massachusetts Irish stock. And like Helen Keller, she graduated from Radcliffe College, only she majored in international relations. After a series of federal jobs, Mary Switzer served as director of the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. She was the commissioner of the Vocational Rehabilitation Administration and became the first administrator of the Social and Rehabilitation Service at HEW. In 1954, her efforts shaped the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, which has been referred to as the Magna Carta in work for the handicapped. Amendments to the Vocational Rehabilitation Act would put vitality into the state federal program for the blind. And she handled such varied responsibilities as keeping a lid on germ warfare during World War II to managing a budget of $7 billion and was known as, quote, an accomplished cutter of red tape, unquote. That would be a title anyone could aspire to. The breadth and humanity of Mary Switzer are stamped forever on the passage of Public Law 565, with its research and demonstration features, its concern for rehabilitation education, its mandate to construct rehabilitation facilities, its totally new understanding of international efforts and international cooperation regarding rehabilitation, and perhaps above all, in its expanded funding base for more personnel and programs for those in need of rehabilitation services. Mary retired in 1970 as the highest ranking woman bureaucrat in the federal government. Josephine Lister Taylor. Jo began her career in the education of the visually handicapped in 1933 as a nursery school teacher in New York. From 1936 to 42, she taught at the Perkins School for the Blind. And then she served as director of educational services for the visually handicapped in New Jersey from 1942 to 1967. Jo had a special love for kids that were multi-handicapped, especially deafblind kids. And while in New York, she was while in New Jersey, she was a strong advocate for public day school programs for kids that were blind or visually impaired. She moved to the Washington area in 1968 and joined the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare Division of Personnel Preparation. And while serving as a project officer and branch chief with the Special Education Services, she continued her role as a strong advocate for educational services for blind and multi-handicapped children, as well as advocating for teacher training programs for those populations. And she retired from the Department of Education in 1982. Well, what a walk, right? These 18 women from the Hall of Fame have been at the forefront, at least of the American effort to improve services and improve training, create standards, and change outcomes and expectations for people who are blind or visually impaired. But there have been countless women working behind the scenes in everyday classrooms and workshops, and I stumble across their stories every day here and in my work at the American Printing House for the Blind. For example, a few years ago, someone donated a Freund longhand writing kit, a product that was introduced in the APH catalog in 1971. And so as a routine part of cataloging the Freund kit, I started trying to find out who this Freund is. And so I discovered Elisabeth Freund. Elisabeth Freund, born in 1898, was born in Breslau, Germany, a part of Germany that's now part of Poland. Her father was a famous neurologist called Freund, and she studied economics and political science at universities in Breslau, Würzburg, and Berlin. A highly educated woman with an academic career in front of her. And she had married, by the 1930s, she had married her husband, Rolf, and they had 3 children living in Berlin. The Freunds were Jewish. And in 1933, Rolf Freund, the the industrialist, was dismissed from his work at a corporation because he was a Jew. And the Freunds were reduced to getting manual labor jobs, the hardest, lowest jobs that were available in German society there because they were Jewish. In January 1939, Elisabeth and her husband managed to send their 3 children out of the country through a British program called Kindertransport. First, they went to the UK and then eventually got to the United States. But when Freund and Rolf tried to get out of Germany themselves, they were unable to come to the United States. They weren't allowed in the United States. The United States was not allowing Jewish immigration. But they did manage to get on one of the last trains that left Germany in 1941 and eventually got on a boat and got to go to Cuba. Now, through a historical curiosity, Elisabeth Freund's great uncle had a brother whose name was Julius Friedlander. Julius Friedlander had helped found what we originally was called the Pennsylvania Institution for the Education of the Blind in Philadelphia, one of the first 3 schools for the blind founded in the U.S. Today we know it, of course, as Overbrook School for the Blind. And so eventually, when Elisabeth was able to get into the United States in 1944, she showed up on the steps of the Overbrook School for the Blind because she knew that her great uncle's brother had worked there, and was able to talk herself into a job working at Overbrook, and went on to become a well-known teacher of kindergarten age kids at Overbrook School for the Blind, developed what's called the Touch and Learn Center at Overbrook, and had created this longhand writing kit to teach kids that were blind how to write in longhand. And it was a product that, as I said, came out from APH in 1971. And actually, she ended up writing a biography in 1959 of Julius Friedlander, which is still the biography of the famous Julius, called Crusader for Life, which you might want to read sometime. Now, as I talk to you today, there is a picture of Elisabeth Freund taped above my computer to remind me not to take the freedoms that we enjoy today for granted. And there are so many other amazing stories left to tell you. Susan Merwin, who we believe was the first woman to head a residential school in the United States, here in Kentucky, the Kentucky School for the Blind, and became the first and the only woman so far to head the American Printing House. In 1917, with her boss, B.B. Huntoon, ailing and bedridden, Susan Merwin traveled to D.C., and her last-minute arrival in the Congressional Committee room and her effective testimony led to the first increase in the Quota Fund, which is administered by the Act to Promote the Education of the Blind, in almost 40 years. Where would we be without Susan Merwin? Or Adelaide Clifford, who became the first female dog trainer for the Seeing Eye, probably the first female dog guide trainer in the United States. Or Emily Amaoka, who was a teacher at the Acropong School for the Blind in the 1950s, in what would later become Ghana. Or Tony Mahler, the technical director at the Deutsche Zentralbücherei für Blinde, which I'm sure I'm butchering it, German speakers, in Leipzig, Germany, who invented the Minerva Braille writer and patented it in 1931. And it's one of the few Braille writers attributed to a female inventor. Marie Antonie Mahler, Tony Mahler, was the niece of another interesting lady, the director of the DZB, Marie Lomnitz-Klamroth, that we don't know nearly enough about. Or Adelia Hoyt, born in 1865, Adelia followed her sister to Washington in 1913 and found work at the Library of Congress Reading Room for the Blind as one of its first blind employees at the age of 48. And she was instrumental in establishing the Braille Transcription Certification Program, a joint effort between the Library of Congress and the American Red Cross, and eventually rose to become Director of Braille. And she would write years later in her memoir, quote, I was determined to succeed now that this opportunity had come to me, not only to earn a fair salary, but to participate in the very kind of work I loved best, that of helping my fellow blind, unquote. And folks, I could go on like this, literally forever. Our lives are surrounded by extraordinary people doing extraordinary things, and all their stories are bound up together. In March, we highlight the stories of women, but it really shouldn't be that way. If we're honest and we give every contributor the credit they are due, every day is Black History Day. Every day is Women's History Day. Every day is Disability History Day, because each is a carefully preserved patch in the amazing quilt that is our history. And that quilt is oh so beautiful, and it looks a lot better hanging on the wall and not folded up in the closet. So that is my spiel this afternoon. So let's all take a deep breath. Now I'd like the floor to throw the floor open for comments about any of the people I've talked about, if you knew them, or questions about anything that I've talked about, or within limits. I'd love to hear from some of you about amazing women in your life from our field, or hints about amazing stories that you know need to be told.
Well, we've had a few already, Mike. One of the first questions is there a virtual museum at APH that includes these contributions from women?
Okay, so there's not a virtual museum, but there is the Hall of Fame website, and all 18 of those ladies I took right out of the Hall of Fame website. So there is when you get inducted into the Hall of Fame, obviously there is a bas-relief plaque that our model maker, Andrew Dakin, downstairs creates that hangs in the hall, but also you get an entry on the website, and you can go to aph.org, and under resources, you can find the Hall of Fame website. There's a lot of information on there about all of the inductees, not just these 18 women.
We have a comment that Sally Mangle was a really neat person and someone who loved working with her. Another comment, something that they were struck by, is the number of women who were blind or visually impaired or acquired the disability later in life and then made contributions to the field.
Yeah, that's a pretty familiar pattern. The schools for the blind, at least in particular, would always cherry pick the best of their graduates, and you see those people coming back to work. Actually, you can kind of even see it before they graduate. I'm most familiar with the Kentucky School for the Blind. I read most widely their history, but you can clearly see that young ladies in their junior and senior year, the brightest kids are already beginning to be almost apprenticed as apprentice teachers, and then they get hired at the school. And then, of course, success breeds success, right? So, once, it's easier to get a job after you've already had a job, right? I think we all have experience with that. And so having experience at the School for the Blind then enabled them sometimes to graduate into, more ambitious jobs down the road.
So the next one is a question. Were any women involved in the passing of what we now know as federal quota?
Okay, that I know of, I have not heard that. The passing of the law in 1879, which is the Act to Promote the Education of the Blind, was largely, from what I've seen, largely a matter of men. Male leaders. Almost every school for the blind in 1879 was a man, and so the ones that were tapped to and there were no women in Congress that I know of in 1879. And if there were, they weren't part of this conversation or on any of these committees. So, but as women become more a part of leadership at the schools, they do begin to play important roles in continuing the growth of that law, in keeping it safe from people that would want to change it. And Susan's story is just one story But it's dramatic because her train is late to getting to DC, and she's late getting into the committee room. But once she gets into the committee room, she just blows her presentation out of the park, and APH gets an increase in the act, and those increases have become a steady part of our job in Washington of educating the Congress about what the act is about, who it serves, and how much how it's funded.
So you have a lot of people really curious, Mike. Do you hold all of this information in your brain, or do you have notes?
Well, I have a lot in my brain, but I will make an admission that I am 57, and it turns out that what happens is that your brain either A, starts to get full, or functionally stops being as good as it once was at helping you find all your laundry. When you go to the laundry closet, sometimes it's just laying around on the floor, and you have to look through it to find things. So this entire presentation was read from notes. But I can't tell a lot of stories right off the top of my head, but they're not as organized as well maybe as they once were.
So one comment was talking about Susan Ponchia, a fantastic woman who helped write the Foundations of Rehabilitation book. Another comment was also my advisor at Western Michigan and had an awesome sense of humor. Another person was lucky enough to have her and her husband teach them at Western Michigan.
Yes. So, there are so many people out there, and a lot of them are women that are worthy of being in the Hall of Fame. And so there is a committee that makes those decisions. And, one thing, just while I'm on my Hall of Fame spiel, is that, the Hall of Fame represents the entirety of North America. And we don't have we don't have a single Spanish speaking member of the Hall of Fame. And that's obviously a great oversight. Certainly in Mexico, there were all kinds of pioneers. And maybe in some of the parts of the United States where more people speak Spanish, that there are teachers there. So I want to encourage anybody who has a person in their life that, they feel like is worthy of the Hall of Fame to get online and find the application procedure and nominate them. And if you need help doing research, we have staff at APH that are available to anybody who's putting together an application. We can help you figure out what the sources you need to make a good application.
Did you happen to mention Dr. Mary Moore from the University of Pittsburgh?
I don't think I did. And I'm not familiar with Mary, so maybe they could tell us a little bit more about her.
And I've given the permission to raise hands if the person who wrote that wants to raise their hand and tell us a bit more. Yeah, someone commiserates with your memory. Stuffed filed cabinet, you shove new stuff in and other stuff falls out. So this is the time when you as an audience can ask your questions. You have a history buff here for our field. I will tell you, Mike, you were the first one to tell me the story of Anne Sullivan actually being in a cage. I did not realize she had been in a cage as a young child.
No, I didn't tell you that story, and it's not true.
That's not true.
It's not true, no.
Okay, it's making its rounds on the internet. So would you like to enlighten us?
Sure. I had one of our board members bring that up to me today and send me something about some old housekeeper or staff member at Tewksbury saying that that Annie was actually kept in a cage, and so if you look at that story, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's some serious flaws in it. Okay, if you're looking at the same thing I responded to this morning, one, it said that Annie and Helen were talking about when Helen was received the Nobel Prize, they were talking about that the credit all belonged to this nameless housekeeper at Tewksbury, And Helen never received a Nobel Prize. She was nominated in 1954, and that was 16 years after Annie was dead. So I don't think that conversation occurred. And the second thing was that, see, Annie and her brother James were basically left on the steps at the Tewksbury Almshouse in Massachusetts, just an awful place. James Sullivan died there, and Annie was deeply scarred by the experience and almost never talked about it. I mean, there's very little, record of her talking about her experiences there. We know that when she arrived at Perkins, the fact that she had clothes on at all was only because the women at Tewksbury, which were the typical combination in those days of unwed mothers and prostitutes, that these women had basically given her various pieces of clothing off their own backs so that she had any clothing at all to wear, and she didn't know how to read or write. And 6 years later, when she graduates from she's the valedictorian. But that story about her being a wild child is almost like a mixture between the story of Helen Keller as told by William Gibson in The Miracle Worker and Annie's. You see how stories, as they get told and retold, they kind of blend together. And so, that story that I've seen is largely myth.
I'm glad I brought it up because
she was not caged. She was not caged. There's no evidence that she was, I don't know, mentally challenged or emotionally disturbed or whatever words you want to use, that she was crazy or chained up or anything like that. No. But Tewksbury was a terrible place. That, she and her brother were left there, but her father was an alcoholic and he couldn't take care of them after her mother died. It's a terrible story. I mean, it's a sad story, but it's also a story that helps us understand is not the right word. It's a story that helps us be even more amazed about Anne Sullivan Macy. Anne Sullivan Macy, one of the most incredible women of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the obstacles that young lady had to overcome to become one of the most famous teachers in the history of education. If that doesn't give you hope, I use that line in some other speeches I give, but if Annie Sullivan's story doesn't give you hope that you're going to be okay and that you can do it and that you can overcome the obstacles in your life, nothing can give you hope. Anne Sullivan is amazing.
You have people listening more than writing now. I am curious, are there any other questions out there? Amber, I know you might be curious about the breakdown of participants in this training, but I will tell you they are all human. There might be a possible dog in there too. We don't know. Love your passion. Is there any mention, Mike, of Laura Bridgman in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, not in the Hall of Fame, but in the museum, Laura Bridgman is there. And actually, I thought about talking a little bit about Laura. Laura was the precursor, if you want to think about it, from Helen, about 25 years before, also deafblind, but her character was just of a much different character than, but she also was a student at the Perkins School, and like Helen, they publicized their early success with Laura Bridgman because, no one really thought that there was anything, just like, maybe 100 years before, they thought there was nothing you could do with kids that were blind, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, the idea was there was nothing you could do with kids that were deafblind. There was no techniques, there was no, study had been made on it. And so the fact that Samuel Gridley Howe, the founder of the Perkins School, was able to teach this kid to read and write and communicate, and then Laura had a kind of different life. I mean, she basically lived at Perkins the rest of her life, and Anne Sullivan knew her and was exposed to her when Anne was going to school. Laura Bridgman was this character, there at the school, and Laura was very religious, very conservative, and very quiet and much more withdrawn. The total opposite from Helen Keller in terms of Helen's, outgoing personality and her inquisitive nature, but still, Laura is an interesting character and a path breaker, a pioneer.
Well, I have a question for you. You were talking about in the tours, there were times when you felt that you might have forgotten to mention a woman as you went through. Are there any well-known women from the American Printing House for the Blind history?
Well, I mentioned Susan Merwin. She's our poster child. I think that another great woman that I'm thinking about, and I'm trying to remember her name right now, but twice in the 1930s, Rose McCann. Twice in the 1930s, the superintendent of the American Printing House of the Blind died just suddenly. And in both cases, the assistant superintendent was Roseanne McCann. Roseanne's brother, Owen, was the production manager at APH, which is a familiar story, by the way, back then, a lot of nepotism. And Roseanne McCann, in both of those cases, when the guy died, she takes over the printing house. But then when it comes time to hire a new superintendent, do they hire Rosa? They do not. They hire a dude. Right, they go find a head from one of the residential schools, and Roseanne goes back to being his assistant, and so that's kind of one of those glass ceiling stories. But in each case, she's a capable administrator, and it's not like the place falls apart under her leadership. It's just that they wouldn't even, they just didn't even think of promoting the woman. Right, they always thought about going out and getting a man.
So when do you think tours at APH will resume?
Well, that's a great question, and we don't know. Obviously, we're keeping our ear very close to the ground in terms of our HR department at APH is doing just bang up work, keeping everybody safe. That we know of, we've had not one in-house transfer of COVID, and wish everybody out there to be safe and take precautions. And we're gonna err on the side of safety because our museum is predicated on touching. You can't have an accessible museum experience, particularly for people with disabilities, without emphasizing touching, and so that involves real challenge of doing a lot of cleaning. We're always going to be cleaning things. Okay, I don't want you to think that we don't have an aggressive cleaning program, but it's just a lot of danger involved there. So I don't know. What do you all think? I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that this summer that we're making great progress with the vaccination, and that will prove effective. And I'm ambitious that by the end of the summer we'll be back and be able to welcome all of our friends and guests and people from all over the world back for tours of the printing house.
I sure hope so. I would like to get back there as myself. So
Yeah.
I want to say thank you, Mike. Very enlightening, as Gina shared. Loved learning about all of the women. So thank you very much. Very impressive, and adds to our Women's History Month.
We should have just everybody History Month every month, and that's my position on it. But thank you all very much for inviting me. Remember that we tell these kinds of stories on our social media pages and on Facebook and in Twitter, and the address there is @APH Museum, @APH Museum. And we welcome you to go online and share in those stories. And if you have stories of your own, or if you're clearing out a storage room sometime in the nearby future and you find something cool, make sure you give me a call.